To get Brent's first love back, I became the kidnapper's new hostage. Brent said the sniper was in position, and I wouldn't be in any danger. But he didn't know that in 5 minutes, the kidnapper would detonate the bomb on him, taking me down with him. The kidnapper pressed the gun to my head and pushed Sigrid toward Brent. I saw Brent nervously checking Sigrid over, then his frown relaxed, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. From start to finish, Brent never turned his head to look at me. "Host," the system's cold voice rang in my ears, "it seems your mission to win over Brent has failed again." It was the 3rd year of my marriage to Brent, and my 9th attempt to win his heart. Unfortunately, he still didn't love me. 10 minutes ago, Brent had agreed without hesitation to the hostage exchange. "Kathy, they fear your family, they won't harm you." Brent, though reluctant, still gave a silent signal to the bodyguard beside him. "The sniper's in place. Sigrid is fragile. I don't want her involved in this bloodshed." The bodyguard's hand rested on my shoulder, pressing down with subtle force. I was frozen, and reluctantly muttered okay, but inside, I couldn't help but curse. Brent had no idea that 5 minutes later, the kidnapper would detonate his bomb, and we'd both die. Once bitten, twice shy, and before I died, I had the system lower my pain threshold with practiced ease. I remembered the first time I tried to win over Brent. Sigrid and I were trapped in a fire, and Brent scooped the unconscious Sigrid into his arms. He glanced at me, wounded and abandoned, and hurriedly said, "Wait for me." Then he disappeared from my sight. At that moment, I naively thought Brent would come back to save me. But after I was burned alive in the flames, I realized Brent was busy consoling the now conscious Sigrid. Perhaps the system saw how much I suffered before dying, so afterward, I gained the ability to adjust my pain sensitivity. The system told me I had one final chance. I knew that if I failed again, not only would my wish never come true, but I'd be completely erased. "Kathy, I don't like you. Have you lost all your dignity?" With a sharp crack, Brent slapped my hand away from his arm. The familiar scene, the familiar words, the familiar hellish beginning. I had returned to the day Brent was forced to marry me. Brent's voice was loud, and the guests immediately turned to look at us. They whispered, their eyes filled with clear mockery. I ignored the malicious looks and the sting in my palm and silently followed Brent, waiting for the first opportunity. As we passed through the hall, the crystal chandelier overhead suddenly began to fall. In the past, I always pulled him aside just in time. Then, I'd feign fear and cry a few tears in his arms. Seeing this, Brent would feel awkward and refrain from speaking harshly to me. But I never expected Sigrid to be standing right beneath the falling light this time. Brent, unwilling for Sigrid to see me, glared at me and threatened, "Kathy, if you don't want to die, get away." But in the next second, he followed my gaze and noticed the chandelier swaying above Sigrid's head. "Watch out!" Brent shouted in panic and lunged at Sigrid. "Brent!" I rushed forward and shoved them apart with all my might. Brent couldn't be hurt. If he died, my mission would fail instantly. In that instant, I didn't have time to adjust my pain threshold. Ah! It felt like my organs were being crushed, and the intense pain made me pass out. That night, our wedding hit the trending topics. The grand, luxurious wedding ended in a joke. In a widely circulated photo, Brent was kneeling on the ground with Sigrid in his arms, his shocked eyes fixed on the scene nearby. There, I lay in a pool of blood, unconscious, life uncertain. When I woke up, I didn't see Brent. Sigrid had an asthma attack from the shock and was sent to the hospital with me. Brent only glanced at me briefly, then stayed by Sigrid's side. My mother, infuriated and helpless, asked me, "Is it really him you want?" "Mom, if anything happens to Brent, I won't be able to live either." I spoke the truth, subtly but honestly, but Brent happened to overhear me as he entered. He looked at me with a complicated expression, a mix of frustration and confusion. He thanked me and then apologized. "She's not fully recovered, so she couldn't thank you in person." After my mom left, Brent casually added, as though Sigrid were the one who had been hurt. Since I didn't want to see Sigrid's fake display of sympathy, I nodded indifferently. The doctor said my condition was unstable, and I couldn't be left alone. Perhaps to repay my life-saving act, Brent volunteered to stay by my side. But not long after, he received a call from Sigrid. Her delicate voice came through the phone, "Brent, are you with Kathy?" I suddenly craved the dessert from that shop on West Street. "I'll go get it now." Without hesitation, Brent agreed before she finished speaking. I clearly saw the smile on Brent's face. That fool, his love-struck brain. After hanging up, Brent seemed to remember the doctor's instructions and looked at me awkwardly. I knew that dessert shop, the line was always long. I generously told Brent not to worry about me. He hesitated for a moment, then stood up. Sorry, I'll be back as soon as I can. He nodded slightly, then casually asked if I wanted some too. I shook my head gently and gave him a hurt yet lonely look. Brent hesitated, then left. A fleeting look of guilt crossed his face. But I never expected things to go this way. As soon as Brent left, I felt a sharp pain in my head. I struggled to stay conscious and pressed the call button. The nurse quickly wheeled me into the ICU, but they couldn't reach Brent to get his signature. The system told me that Brent was in line and hadn't heard the phone ringing. God, I should never have pretended to be understanding to gain his favor. I regretted it immediately, rolling my eyes before losing consciousness entirely. When I woke up again, I saw the slap mark on Brent's face and couldn't help but laugh. Kathy. Brent turned his face away in annoyance. Did you do this on purpose? I was only gone for 10 minutes, and you got yourself into the ICU? I shook my head, holding back my smirk and weakly murmured, sorry. Perhaps out of guilt, Brent froze for a moment before awkwardly closing his mouth. That day, for once, Brent stayed with me until Sigrid once again troubled him. Brent, is Kathy awake? After I had the dessert, my stomach's bothering me. Can you call the doctor for me? Princess's orders, Brent was duty-bound to follow. Rest well, I'll come to help you check out next week. Before hurrying off, he threw me a brief instruction. I nodded but didn't really care. Brent had said similar things countless times. But without fail, he would always break his promises, because of Sigrid. After he left, I noticed a small cake on the table. It had been there too long, the cream had melted and congealed in a sticky mess. It looked completely unappetizing. Without any expression, I threw it in the trash. The day I was discharged, Sigrid happened to be moving. Brent sent his assistant to pick me up. When I woke up from the sofa, I realized I was covered in Brent's coat. Brent was working in his study, and I decided to seize the chance to be attentive. I brought him a cup of hot milk. Thanks. Brent didn't lift his head, frowning as he rubbed his chest. That immediately set off alarm bells in my head. Brent has congenital heart disease, and whenever he feels unwell, he does this. Where's your medicine? I noticed Brent's lips were turning purple and nervously asked. I accidentally left it at Sigrid's house. She said she has a lot of stuff to move, and she'll give it to me when she finds it in a few days. Brent acted as if it didn't matter, and my frustration instantly flared. Do you have a problem with your heart or your brain? Doesn't she know how important that medicine is? I was so angry that I raised my voice. In a few days, you might turn to dust. As soon as I mentioned Sigrid, Brent's face turned sour. He got up, his expression stern, and grabbed my arm roughly. Get out. Brent was so strong that I felt a sharp pain in my back. It hurts, my wound has reopened. I cried out, but Brent ignored me and dragged me toward the door. Let go of me. No matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't break free, so I bit his arm in desperation. Brent suddenly stopped. He let go of my arm and bent down in pain. With a loud thud, I watched as Brent collapsed right in front of me. I searched frantically, but Brent's spare medicine was gone too. I had never seen Brent so seriously ill before, and I was completely at a loss. The system alerted me that Brent could only last another 20 minutes. The nearest city hospital was only a 5-minute drive away. Thanks to the system, I managed to carry Brent on my back. Ouch. The pain from my back wound flared up again, and I couldn't help but groan. Warm liquid soaked both my clothes and Brent's. But I gritted my teeth and struggled toward the parking lot. Kathy, Brent murmured weakly, put me down, you're bleeding. He caused me to lose my balance, and I stumbled, nearly falling to the ground. When I cried out in pain, Brent ignored me, but now, when I was trying to save him, he was causing more trouble. Don't move. I shouted in frustration, slapping Brent hard on the back. You. Whether out of anger or embarrassment, he passed out again just after he spoke. I shoved Brent into the car and, as soon as I touched the steering wheel, a chill ran down my spine. The painful memories rushed in. It felt like my hands and feet were frozen, and tears began to flow uncontrollably. I cried out, begging the system for help. The next second, the car engine started. Help! Help! As soon as I reached the hospital, I screamed, dragging Brent out of the car. Brent can't have anything happen to him. I was frantic, watching him being carried away on a stretcher. Then my legs went weak, and I collapsed to my knees, covering my face as I cried. This hospital was very familiar to me. I had come here with Brent many times. Each time, I would accidentally pass by a certain room. Through the glass on the door, I would steal glances at the person lying in the bed. He looked as if he was sleeping peacefully. Just like he had when he lay beside me in the past. But now, not only was I unable to stay by his side, I had to keep praying over and over again for the safety of another man. Brent and I shared a hospital room. He even woke up half a day before me. This is the first time I've seen someone get admitted to the ICU because of excessive sadness. Brent's words sounded sarcastic. But there was a hint of confusion in his eyes. He casually asked me if I was really that afraid of him dying. I stared into his eyes, which resembled another person's, and nodded seriously. You know, if something happens to you, I won't be able to live either. This was the second time I had said this. After a long pause, Brent threw me a "you're crazy," and turned away to lie down, not saying another word. I noticed a faint red blush creeping up his ears. The air around us fell silent. But in my ears, the system's alarm kept ringing. Brent's heart rate was spiking higher and higher. After an unknown amount of time, Brent suddenly sat up. He furrowed his brows, looking troubled. After a while, he said with a helpless expression, "I won't do this again." This was the first time Brent had promised me something after I saved his life again. Before being discharged, Brent told me that his cousin was also in this hospital. "Tomorrow is my cousin's birthday, I'll take you to see him," Brent said, then awkwardly added, "After all, you're my wife in name." My heart skipped a beat. But it wasn't because of what he said afterward. I suppressed my excitement and nodded. The next day, I bought a bouquet of purple irises. Brent glanced at them and raised an eyebrow, commenting on the coincidence. He said his cousin had a collection of paintings of irises at home. "Really? That's a coincidence, then," I replied indifferently. I followed Brent and stood by the bed of his cousin. I repeatedly traced his cousin's features with my eyes. Fighting back the tightness in my throat, I blinked rapidly to keep the tears from falling. "Dennis, wait for me." Once I went over Brent. "You'll wake up." On the way back, I felt dizzy. Brent called my name several times, but I didn't respond. "What's wrong with you?" Brent pressed the horn and complained. "You were staring at my cousin at the hospital, and now you're acting all spaced out. What's going on with you?" Brent looked at me suspiciously. I was afraid he would notice something. So I lied, saying Dennis looked too much like him, and it made me lose focus for a moment. Brent, remembering how I had ended up in the ICU because of him, patiently reassured me a little. In the previous attempts to win him over, Brent had never noticed my interest in Dennis. But now, he was clearly paying more attention to my every move. Maybe the chandelier incident really triggered a butterfly effect. After Brent was discharged, he stayed busy, and my progress in winning him over stagnated. It wasn't until 3 months later that Brent suggested we go to the temple together. It was a clear day, and surprisingly, Brent wasn't called away by Sigrid. He walked with me up the 99 steps in front of the temple. Halfway up, he complained that I was walking too slowly and took my hand without hesitation. He asked, confused, why I came to pray every month. "I pray for the one I love, wishing for his early recovery and a life free from worries," I whispered, looking reverently at the Buddha in front of me. Without noticing Brent's intense gaze on me. As we descended, Brent suddenly stopped me. "Kathy," he said, rubbing his nose awkwardly yet seriously, "my heart won't have problems anytime soon. So, you don't have to come every month." Brent misunderstood my prayer before the Buddha. I lowered my head and smiled wryly, not bothering to explain. Instead, I played along and said a few sweet words to comfort him. That evening, we stayed in a guest house halfway up the mountain. The night view was beautiful, and Brent said he would stay with me to watch the stars. But just as he finished speaking, he received a call from Sigrid. Sigrid's house had lost power. She was afraid of the dark and wanted Brent to come keep her company. Brent hesitated, looking at me, torn for the first time. "Please don't go, okay?" I suddenly felt like testing him, so I tugged at his sleeve, pleading in a pitiful voice. Brent bit his lip, his expression changing as he struggled with his feelings. Then, suddenly, there was a loud crash from the phone. "Sigrid. What happened?" Brent snapped back to reality, no longer looking at me, only urgently asking Sigrid what happened. "Brent, I can't move my leg, can you come?" Sigrid seemed to be hurt, and she kept crying, urging Brent to hurry. "Wait for me, I'll be there soon." Brent frowned, suddenly pulling away from the arm I was holding. I was caught off guard and fell to the ground, my head hitting a stone table nearby. Hearing the noise, Brent turned his head, seemingly about to come over to help me. But he was stopped in his tracks by Sigrid's voice on the other end of the phone. After Brent left, I received his message. He asked if I had hurt myself badly when I fell. Then he said he'd come pick me up first thing in the morning. I self-deprecatingly threw the phone aside. I didn't pay attention to the wound on my forehead. Instead, I sat in the yard and started counting the stars. Dennis once told me that every star in the sky represents a wish from someone in the world. But suddenly, it started raining, and everything turned gray. I couldn't find the star that belonged to me anymore. "System, will I still fail this time?" The system didn't answer, only letting out a pitiful sigh. In that moment, pain, grievance, sadness, and exhaustion. All the negative emotions surged in my heart. I couldn't hold it in anymore and broke down in tears. I cried so hard that I couldn't tell if the wetness on my face was from the rain or my tears. Until an umbrella covered me from the wind and rain. "Kathy." A familiar voice called out. I quickly looked up, hardly believing my eyes. I had never seen Brent looking so disheveled. His hair was wet, sticking messily to his forehead. "Kathy," Brent gasped, irritated. "Are you planning to cry here all night?" I looked at the redness spreading across Brent's face and felt deeply worried. "Brent, is your heart okay?" Brent stared at me with a complicated expression, opening his mouth as if he wanted to say something but then stopping. The air was so quiet, it felt like only the sound of the rain was left. But once again, the system's alarm went off. It was because Brent's heart hadn't calmed down for a long time. "Ugh." A resigned sigh broke the silence. Brent's lips curved up, a mix of helpless affection. "Kathy." He suddenly bent down and got closer to me, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. His breath brushed my face. "If you keep looking at me like this, I'm going to kiss you." Brent softly told me to close my eyes. He was getting closer and closer. I was startled and quickly turned my head. His warm lips brushed against the corner of my mouth. This was my 10th attempt at winning over Brent. But it was also the first time he kissed me. Brent explained that after the heavy rain, he had felt uneasy. So he ignored Sigrid's pleas and braved the rain to come back to the guest house to find me. "I'm glad I came back, or you'd still be out there in the rain." Though it sounded like a complaint, Brent's eyes were filled with concern. I just quietly thanked him and fell silent. After I avoided Brent's kiss, the atmosphere between us became subtly awkward. This was the first time Brent had left Sigrid for me. I should have been happy. But because of that kiss, I was filled with anxiety. I didn't know how much longer it would take to successfully win Brent over. And I was even more worried about what he might do to me during this process. This time, my progress in winning over Brent was much smoother than before. But I began to fall into a strange cycle. I wanted to conquer Brent quickly. But I also resisted any possibility of getting too physically close to him. Luckily, Brent had been traveling a lot lately, so he didn't have much time for me. Though I was conflicted, I spent several months in peace. Until one day, the scene from my previous life suddenly replayed. 2 years earlier than before, Sigrid was once again captured by kidnappers. It was the same old familiar line, the condition for exchanging hostages was that I would replace Sigrid. I looked up and locked eyes with Brent, and my heart twisted painfully. He stepped forward and hugged me tightly, his body trembling. "Sorry, Kathy." His lips lingered near my ear, and I heard his reluctant murmur. In that instant, a bone-deep despair consumed me. Brent's bodyguards, just like in my previous life, held my shoulders tightly. This was my last chance. I had to take the gamble. I knew that Brent responded better to gentleness than force, so I was about to kneel in front of him. But the next scene completely caught me off guard. I saw Brent turn and raise his hands, stepping toward the kidnappers. Brent said that as the CEO of the group, he was more valuable than a married woman from a small family. The kidnappers clearly hesitated, and they began to urge Brent forward with guns. I was stunned, my mind going blank, with only one voice repeating over and over in my head. He can't be harmed. I struggled like crazy, trying to rush over. But the bodyguards held me back tightly. Brent! Come back! Come back! I collapsed on the ground in despair, my vision blurring. I cried out loudly, wanting to tell him that the kidnappers had a bomb. But the system blocked my voice. Sigrid was still crying and urging Brent to save her. Brent, however, stopped in his tracks, and for the first time, he turned his head back to me. He stared at me deeply and mouthed, telling me not to worry. I shook my head desperately, watching helplessly as the kidnappers shoved Sigrid aside. The gun was aimed at Brent's forehead. Bang! In the next second, blood splattered everywhere. Ah! Sigrid screamed and fainted. Brent's face was covered in blood. At his feet, the kidnapper lay dead. The bodyguards released me, but my legs were too weak to move. I saw them move forward to carry Sigrid, while Brent passed them without stopping, heading straight for me. It's okay, Kathy. It's okay. Brent pulled me into his arms, repeatedly patting my back to comfort me. My body trembled uncontrollably. I gently wiped the blood from his face. Then, using all my strength, I slapped him hard across the face. Brent! I growled angrily at him. Is Sigrid the only life that matters to you? Do you think everyone else is just expendable? Brent was stunned by my slap, but he knew he was in the wrong, repeatedly apologizing. I had come so close to failing my mission. I suddenly remembered my previous 9 deaths. I thought about how Brent had disregarded his own safety just now. Old grudges and new grievances surged up together. In my fury, I spat blood on his face. I saw Brent's eyes widen in shock. Kathy! Kathy! He held me tightly, calling my name in desperation. But I only felt my eyelids grow heavy, and my mind became foggy. Before I lost consciousness, I think I heard the system's voice congratulating me. When I woke up, I was still in a daze. The system said that the moment I fainted, I had successfully conquered Brent. It was my final chance, and in less than a year. It felt like I was living in a dream. Host, congratulations, the system said, sounding a bit relieved. Now, you can exchange your reward. The system told me that on the day I spat blood, Brent had gone crazy, holding me and rushing outside. If the bodyguards hadn't held him back and rushed me to the hospital in time, Brent would most likely have ended up in the ICU due to heart strain. Host, if no suitable heart source is found for the surgery, Brent will only have 2 years left to live. The system asked me to think carefully before making a decision. Should Brent receive a matching heart, or should Dennis wake up? System, why do you think I need to consider this? I was confused, even finding it a bit funny. I was willing to endure everything to win over Brent, just to make Dennis wake up. From the beginning to the end, Dennis is my unwavering and only choice. Brent handed me the apple, which was all uneven and lumpy from peeling. It was obvious, as a pampered young master, Brent had no experience in taking care of others. I waved my hand in disdain, once again making it clear that I didn't want him to stay with me. Brent slumped his shoulders, his expression instantly darkening. I'm sorry. I really won't make you worry anymore. I had once told Brent that if anything ever happened to him, I wouldn't be able to live either. Back then, he promised me there wouldn't be a next time. But now, he had broken that promise over the hostage situation. I withdrew my hand and replied coldly, do as you please. Anyway, my task was already completed. And whatever he did to himself no longer had anything to do with me. I meant every word, but Brent mistakenly thought I was still upset with him. He tried to keep the conversation going, but I remained indifferent. Until he suddenly mentioned Dennis, the one who had been on my mind day and night. Kathy, my cousin woke up a couple of days ago. The doctors said it was a miracle. Sigrid has always liked my cousin, and she was so emotional, she cried for a long time. I figured Brent probably wanted to distance himself from Sigrid in front of me. But I scoffed and rolled my eyes dramatically. Back then, I had gotten so jealous of Sigrid that I made a sarcastic remark to Dennis, telling him he was such a heartthrob with so many girls liking him. Elsa, it's not the same. I still remember how seriously Dennis had looked at me when he said, I am destined to meet you in this life, my love. When our eyes met, it felt like we only saw each other. My name used to be Elsa, and my lover was Dennis. We loved each other for years, until a car accident separated us by life and death. But now, I am Kathy. And I'm also Dennis's cousin's legal wife. The night I was discharged from the hospital, I went to the restaurant Brent and I had agreed to meet at. He had said he prepared a surprise for me, and I also had something I needed to tell him. But I hadn't expected that, because of Sigrid, he would miss the appointment again. On the phone, he kept explaining that Sigrid had been rejected by Dennis and was heartbroken, so she got drunk at a bar and threatened to kill herself. Let me take Sigrid home, and then I'll come find you. Brent kept apologizing and begging me to wait for him. I was thinking about the thing I still hadn't said, so I had no choice but to patiently wait. At 10 p.m., fireworks suddenly erupted in the sky. The waiter told me it was a surprise Brent had prepared for me. I stared at the empty chair across from me, feeling the waiter had a sense of humor. I just wanted to go home and sleep. Yawning, I called Brent. A familiar female voice picked up. I'm Sigrid. Her voice was sweet, with no trace of drunkenness. He's taking a shower. If it's urgent, I can bring him the phone. Sigrid acted as if she understood, but her words showed a closeness to Brent. No need, I replied, amused. If you want to bathe with him, you don't need to make up an excuse. Sigrid was trying to get back at me by humiliating me because of her disappointment with Dennis. But she didn't know that even if she and Brent were in bed together right now, I wouldn't care one bit. On the way home, my phone suddenly buzzed with a notification, followed by a flood of messages. #mysterious woman appears again, kissing CEO Brent passionately on the street. The explosive headline instantly piqued my curiosity. At the same time, Brent called me. Don't believe what's being said online. Sigrid got drunk and suddenly kissed me. I pushed her away as soon as I could. He sounded both furious and anxious, as if he had suffered a huge injustice. I clicked on the hot search and saw the photos. I had to admit, the angle was perfect. In the photo, Sigrid was on tiptoe, eyes closed, kissing Brent's lips. Though Brent's face was in shadow and his expression unclear. It didn't exactly look like he was unwilling. Maybe this photo would come in handy later? I glanced at the divorce papers waiting for Brent's signature. And before the PR team could delete anything, I pressed the save button. Brent and I returned home one after the other. Without a word, Brent knelt down in front of me, apologizing in an over-the-top manner. Did he really need to go this far with the apology? I jumped in surprise, watching him nervously lift one leg, solemnly pulling out a pair of rings. He said with deep affection that this was something he owed me from our wedding day. Listening to his hurried breathing, I couldn't help but worry that he might faint again when we talked about the divorce. I awkwardly avoided looking at the rings and handed him the divorce papers. Did you grab the wrong thing? Brent only glanced at the papers and his expression immediately darkened. But the next moment, he saw my name signed on the documents. His face turned helpless, clearly panicking. Please believe me, I really don't have anything with Sigrid. He became frantic, his eyes reddening. Last night, she threw up on me. I had to get my assistant to bring me new clothes. After I cleaned up, I was planning to come find you, but that's why I was delayed. She once saved me, and when she said she wanted to end her life, I couldn't just ignore it. I was wrong, I promise I won't leave you for her again. I swear, Kathy. Sigrid saving Brent from a heart attack had caused quite a stir at our school. After Brent woke up, he immediately fell for her. He became her most dedicated suitor. Looking back, my 9 tragic deaths were probably part of their little game. I felt a surge of anger and interrupted him impatiently. Brent, you don't need to keep making promises, just sign the papers. I had never spoken to Brent like this before. He stood frozen, his lips pressed together, looking both lost and wronged. I turned my head to avoid looking at him, but after a while, I felt my knee sink. He had knelt and wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his head on my lap. "Kathy, I love you." Brent's voice was muffled. I tried to stand up, but his arms gripped me tightly. "I should have told you earlier. I was wrong. I won't let you suffer again. So, can we not talk about the divorce? Please, I beg you." Brent kept making promises, like a rejected puppy awkwardly trying to win back his master's affection. The moment the task was completed, I knew he loved me. But I never imagined the first time he would say, "I love you," would be after I had already mentioned divorce. Doesn't he know how cheap late confessions are? I frowned in distaste. "Brent, I have to divorce you." My tone was firm, with no room for negotiation. "Because I don't love you." For a moment, Brent's eyes turned bloodshot, staring at me intensely. I had thought Brent would angrily question me. But to my surprise, the next moment, he broke into a silly grin. He even rubbed his head affectionately in my lap. Was he mentally unstable from the shock? I was completely confused by Brent's behavior, but he confidently said, "So you were just saying that out of anger?" He sounded almost relieved. "With so many reasons to divorce, you actually said you don't love me. You've risked your life for me so many times, and even said if something happened to me, you wouldn't be able to live. You've gone to temples to pray for me every month, and when I went to find Sigrid, you silently cried alone in the rain. Even when I became a hostage, you were ready to replace me, crying desperately. Everything you've done for me, one thing after another, how could you not love me?" With every word Brent spoke, his expression grew more sorrowful. As he continued, his smile faded, and his voice began to tremble. A tear suddenly dropped onto my hand. "I'm sorry." His voice cracked with the hint of tears. This wasn't the first time Brent had apologized to me. But it was the first time I truly felt the guilt and regret pouring from him. Brent's tears soaked the divorce agreement. I remained silent, waiting until his emotions had calmed before speaking. I told him I was moving out and would only meet him again when he was ready to divorce. But Brent stubbornly shook his head, insisting that he would never divorce me, no matter what. "This time, it's me chasing after you," he said. "I'll wait until the day you forgive me." Brent's gaze was as serious as Dennis's. I froze for a moment. Brent was certain that when I said I didn't love him, it was just a harsh reaction from a heart broken too many times. I was at a loss for words. In that moment, I even wanted to tell him everything. But then I thought of Dennis, and the relationship between him and Brent, so I bitterly swallowed the impulse. I knew that, with my current situation, I no longer had the right to be with Dennis. All I wanted now was to divorce Brent as soon as possible. And then move on, walking alone through the rest of my life. Brent took the initiative to contact the TV station for a live interview. He apologized for the news on our wedding day and cleared up the photos from a few days ago that had been taken secretly. "I did once have feelings for Sigrid, but now, I only love my wife, Kathy. I've made many mistakes, hurt her deeply, and now I just want to spend the rest of my life making it up to her." Brent completely ignored the surprised host beside him and publicly punished himself with complete seriousness. "Kathy, I'm sorry. I love you." As the camera zoomed in, the love in Brent's eyes was so intense it seemed like it would spill out of the screen. The comments were polarized. Some called Brent a scumbag, while others praised him as a real man. Some said a man who repents is worth more than gold, while others thought that late love is less valuable than grass. My phone was nearly exploding with messages. Even my mother was moved by Brent's public display and urged me several times. "Talk to him tonight." I listened to the busy tone in the phone and felt a sharp headache. I just wanted to quietly divorce, but now Brent was making it a public spectacle. My loyal image had already been deeply ingrained in people's minds, and I couldn't use "no feelings" as a reason to divorce anymore. Many netizens left comments, saying that I had endured hardship and now should remember to forgive Brent after I had tortured him. It seemed everyone loved the plotline of "you ignore me when I love you, but regret it and pursue me when I leave." But the most frustrating thing was Brent. In addition to constantly going to my parents' place to show his kindness, he repeatedly asked me when I planned to torture him. "Now that so many people are watching, can you give me a chance to start over?" Brent pleaded with his magnetic voice, sounding pitiful. I laughed in frustration, sent him a message saying this is moral kidnapping, and immediately blocked his contact. When I saw Brent standing at my doorstep, I remembered what my mom had said. The night air was chilly, and Brent was wearing only a thin shirt. His pale face showed signs of exhaustion, but when he saw me, his eyes lit up instantly. "Kathy," Brent lifted the thermos, smiling at me in an attempt to please me. "I made soup for you, but I couldn't reach you, so I ended up waiting here at your door." I took the thermos, thanked him, and politely asked him to leave. But Brent shamelessly insisted on staying until I finished the soup. The soup had gone cold. I took a sip and immediately realized it wasn't the soup my mother usually made. It was just awful. I looked up and caught Brent's gaze, and noticed the band-aid on his hand. I understood right away, and in front of him, I poured the soup down the sink. Brent couldn't stop me in time, standing behind me, wanting to say something but holding back. "Has Sigrid ever told you that the soup you made is awful?" I barely finished the sentence before seeing Brent's face turn bright red. No. I've never made soup for Sigrid. I'm a beginner, I'll definitely do better next time. Brent forced a smile and lightly held my hand. "Next time, it'll probably taste worse." I felt exhausted and didn't want to keep dodging, so my tone grew harsher. "I didn't just throw the soup away because it was bad, but because it was made by you. I don't need your gestures, so please don't come around to bother me until you agree to divorce." I expected Brent to get angry or at least leave coldly. But he just fell silent, and after a moment, asked quietly, "Kathy, can I accompany you to the temple tomorrow?" Seeing the longing in his eyes, I suddenly remembered. That tomorrow was the day I was supposed to pray for Dennis. But Dennis had already woken up, so there was no need for me to keep going there. I shook my head at Brent. "I don't need you to come with me." I stared at the disappointment in Brent's expression and added, "I won't go again in the future." The moment the words left my mouth, the disappointment on Brent's face turned into despair. That night, Brent left after weakly smiling and saying goodnight, his eyes red. He didn't bother me for a while, until one day. He urgently asked to meet me. I agreed, but once again, Brent missed the appointment. "Kathy," Brent's voice was anxious over the phone. "I'm at my cousin's place, something happened to him, so I can't meet you now." My heart skipped a few beats. "Dennis, what happened to him?" My mind went blank, and I turned, running as fast as I could toward Dennis's house. I saw someone sitting at the edge of the rooftop from a distance. A slender figure, as if it could be blown away by the wind at any moment. Tears streamed down my face, and I ran faster and faster. "Dennis, Elsa is dead, but I'm here with you. If you really jump, I won't live either." Just as I reached the edge of the rooftop, I heard Sigrid sobbing. "Miss Sigrid, I don't know what my parents did to make you misunderstand." And then, the voice I had been dreaming of for so long rang out. "Whether you live or die, what does it have to do with me?" Dennis, always gentle, now coldly retorted. Sigrid, embarrassed, turned and left. She bumped into me roughly, but I didn't have time to argue with her. "Dennis!" I yelled, and both of them turned their heads. Dennis's eyes were filled with confusion, he didn't recognize me. "Kathy, what are you doing here?" Brent, too, looked at me, puzzled, as I stood there, tears streaming down my face. "Brent, don't ask, please, just go downstairs and wait for us." I pleaded, and Brent's face changed several times before he silently left. The wide rooftop was now left with just Dennis and me. "Dennis." "Sir, could you please come down first?" I cautiously stepped closer to Dennis. He shook his head and gave a polite but distant smile. "Miss Kathy, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you on our first meeting." Dennis said he was happy because he would soon be reunited with his lover. I watched as his body leaned even farther out. "Don't. Dennis. Elsa isn't dead." In my desperation, I blurted it out. Dennis froze and turned to look at me in confusion. "Dennis, Elsa isn't dead, she just can't be with you anymore." The grievance I had been holding back exploded in that moment, and I cried out. "She became someone else, even someone's wife now, she can never come back to you. She can't come back." My heart felt like it was being ripped apart, and I collapsed to my knees. Until I fell into a warm embrace. "Is it you?" Dennis's voice trembled as he repeated the question over and over again. I cried so hard that no sound came out, all I could do was nod desperately and hold him tighter. I heard Dennis softly ask me if the reason I hadn't recognized him all this time was because of Brent. I frowned, not knowing how to explain to him. But it seemed Dennis misunderstood. He even tried to comfort me, telling me not to feel bad. If you just want to be Kathy, to be Brent's wife, I will keep this secret. All I want is for you to be happy. Dennis' smile looked worse than tears, and for a moment, I felt both angry and heartbroken. Are you really just going to let me go so easily? I muttered unhappily and then kissed Dennis on the lips. I was fully focused on him, not hearing the approaching footsteps. What are you two doing? Brent's furious shout came, his eyes wide in disbelief as he looked at me and Dennis. So this is why you want a divorce? My cousin has only just woken up, and you're already hooking up with him? After we came down from the rooftop, Brent kept mocking me with cold sarcasm. Seeing his face grow paler with every word, I couldn't help but ask if he had his medicine. Why didn't you worry about my heart when you kissed him just now? Brent raised his voice, sarcastically asking me. Under Brent's angry glare, I hesitated but eventually told him everything. From my rebirth, to the system, and how I had to strategize to save Dennis. I didn't mention the fact that I had failed the first 9 times and died horribly. Since I had finally succeeded, bringing it up now would only make me seem like I was seeking sympathy. At first, Brent frowned deeply, but as I continued, his expression turned to stone, unreadable. So, when you said you didn't love me, that was the truth, wasn't it? Seeing me nod, Brent suddenly kicked over the coffee table in front of me, his expression twisted with rage. You're playing with me. How dare you play with me? Brent gritted his teeth, as if he was going to rush at me and tear me apart. But in the next second, tears began streaming down his face. I had never seen Brent look so hopeless. He cried silently, fragile as if a light touch would break him. I opened my mouth, but I didn't know what to say to comfort him. Kathy, Brent's hoarse voice came, you're the most hateful woman I've ever met. Brent grabbed my chin forcefully, forcing me to lift my head to meet his gaze. Hatred, unwillingness, pain, sorrow. Brent's expression shifted, then he gave a bitter, resigned smile. I should hate you, Kathy. He murmured, deflating, and rested his head on my shoulder. But why can't I bring myself to hate you? That day, I parted ways with Brent on a bad note. You'll never get a divorce from me. Brent's tone was more serious than ever. He said that even if I had lied to him, he wouldn't let me have things my way. After Brent left, Dennis asked me if I wanted to talk. I shook my head silently. Dennis was a thoughtful person. If he knew the truth, he would likely blame himself even more. No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you. Dennis didn't ask any further questions, instead placing a soft kiss on my forehead. I told Dennis that I would handle things with Brent soon. But when every lawyer in the city refused to take my divorce case, I couldn't help but call Brent, asking him what he wanted. You've lied to me, and now you expect me to make way for your love? Brent immediately began with harsh words. I suppressed my displeasure and explained. If it hadn't been for the accident last time, I would never have told Dennis the truth about my identity. I want a divorce, because I don't love you. Brent angrily told me to shut up. You were the one who came after me first. Divorce? Don't even think about it. Brent's obsession completely triggered my anger, and I retorted bitterly. We're married only in name. If you won't divorce me, I'll hire a male model every day. Brent hung up without saying another word. Once I regained my composure, I realized I might have said something too harsh. Then I heard a deliberate cough from behind. I turned around and saw Dennis standing at the door. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. Dennis appeared conflicted, though his eyes held a smile. I've thought about it carefully, and I still want to ask. Before you get a male model, would you consider me instead? I knew Dennis was just teasing me to make me laugh. But for a moment, I couldn't help but blush. After Dennis left, not long after, my phone rang. What was Dennis doing at your place for so long? Brent's voice was slurred, drunk, and he immediately began angrily questioning me. I didn't feel like talking to a drunk, and was about to hang up. But then his tone softened, and he weakly pleaded. Please listen to me, okay? I was wrong. I shouldn't have made you angry this afternoon. I miss you so much. How can you be so cruel to me? Tell me what's so good about Dennis, and I'll change, I swear. My heart hurts so much. If you don't come back, I'll throw the medicine away. Brent rambled on, but I felt overwhelmed. I remembered what the system had said, and I couldn't help but feel frustrated. Your heart can't handle this anymore. Please stop being so stubborn. There was a sudden silence from the other end. After a moment, Brent suddenly asked if, after all my trips to the temple, I had ever prayed for him. Even just once. His voice cracked with emotion. I suddenly remembered, on the day Dennis woke up and went to the temple to fulfill his vow. I had already stepped out of the Buddhist hall, but turned around and knelt again, praying for Brent's happiness and health. I thought, if Dennis could wake up, Brent must have played a key role in that. But the truth was too cruel. If I told him everything, Brent might really die from rage. Seeing that I hadn't spoken for a while, Brent let out a bitter laugh. You really have no heart. He murmured, and the call was abruptly cut off. I sighed and called Brent's secretary. That night, Brent was sent back to the hospital. The doctor said that if he kept recklessly hurting himself, his heart might only last for another year. Brent's calm voice came over the phone, saying he wanted to see me. We arranged to meet on the third day after he was discharged. But the night before our meeting, something happened. When I woke up again, I found myself lying in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Sigrid was standing in front of me, her face twisted with rage. Kathy. Her sharp voice cut through the silent night, sending a chill down my spine. You shameless woman. Having Brent wasn't enough, now you're trying to seduce Dennis too. Brent actually warned me for you. What kind of potion did you feed him? She slapped me twice as she spoke, and the taste of blood filled my mouth. My body felt weak and powerless, and I remained silent, knowing I couldn't provoke her recklessly. But Sigrid had gone mad. She laughed and said she would set fire to the place, making it look like a suicide. You crazy woman. I spat blood and saliva at her face in fury, but she only laughed louder. The warehouse was large, and Sigrid had set fire to a corner on the first floor. She didn't want me to die too quickly. She said she wanted me to watch death approach, suffering every moment. My phone was nearby, but I had no strength to reach it. The system had retired the moment I succeeded in my task. Without its protection, there was nothing I could do but wait to die. Being burned alive was painful, but unfortunately, I couldn't adjust the pain anymore. I thought in despair, until I heard someone calling my name. With the sound of hurried footsteps, before I could see who it was, I was tightly held in their arms. Why are you here? I stood frozen, staring at Brent in front of me. He was still wearing a hospital gown, and there was a patch of blood on the back of his hand. What's wrong? Disappointed that it wasn't Dennis coming to find you? Brent panted, his voice tinged with bitterness. Before I could answer, he suddenly scooped me up and started running toward the exit. Brent focused on dodging the thick smoke but forgot to watch out for the stacked wooden crates at his side. Bang! A loud crash sounded, and I could almost hear the sound of bones breaking. When the crates collapsed, Brent held me tightly in his arms. Brent! Brent's leg was pinned under the crates. I wanted to help him, but I was powerless. His face turned pale as he coughed up a mouthful of blood. He tightened his arms around me. Don't waste your energy. There was no signal in the warehouse, and my phone was useless. Despair once again descended upon us. Kathy, if it weren't for Dennis, would you love me? In the deafening silence, Brent's voice suddenly broke through. He looked down at me, stubbornly waiting for an answer. I felt a pang of sympathy but still shook my head. When you first abandoned me for Sigrid, I was doomed to never love you. The kind of love I want is one where we respect each other and where there's only ever one person we favor. Brent's eyes reddened in an instant, and he forced a smile, one that was more painful than crying. Even if I'm dying, you still won't lie to me. I whispered an apology, but Brent closed his eyes and stopped looking at me. The smoke grew thicker, and I had no idea how much time had passed. I thought I heard someone shouting my name. Brent suddenly lifted my head, gently rubbing his thumb against my lips. His gaze was filled with longing, as if he was unwilling to let go. I put a tracker in your phone. On the way to find you, I hesitated for a long time but still ended up texting Dennis. Right now, I'm so glad I made that decision. Even if you're still cruel to me, I can't bear to have you die with me. A sigh reached my ears, and the next moment, my lips were met with a damp heat. Brent kissed me fiercely. I was so desperate I bit down on his lip. But it wasn't until Dennis arrived that the kiss finally stopped. The fire was spreading faster, and the crates were too heavy. Dennis couldn't move them at all. Get Kathy out first. As Brent spoke, he handed me over to Dennis. Dennis quickly noticed my swollen lips, and his grip around me tightened. Embarrassed, I buried my face against his chest. I'll be right back to get you. When Dennis turned to leave, I heard Brent's voice. Kathy, does it hurt when you're burned alive? I snapped my head up, unable to believe my ears. When our eyes met, the sadness in Brent's gaze almost overflowed. He lowered his head dejectedly and muttered. Turns out all those dreams were real. Dennis, Brent said with a faint smile, looking at Dennis. You know? The reason you woke up is because I finally fell in love with Kathy. But actually, this is the 10th time she's tried to make me love her. She failed 9 times, and each time, she died because I didn't love her. She endured all the pain I caused her, endured the torture of death, just to fulfill the wish of waking you up. She loves you deeply, so you must cherish her. I never expected Brent to have regained all his memories, nor did I expect him to reveal everything to Dennis. He spoke so seriously, almost like he was delivering his last words. Dennis's hands trembled as he held me, tears falling onto my face. When Dennis and I escaped, the firefighters had just arrived. Dennis set me down and was about to rush back into the flames, but as he turned, the warehouse suddenly collapsed. I stepped forward and held on to him tightly. Dennis cried out, calling Brent's name over and over, frantic. I looked at the raging fire before me and remembered the longing in Brent's eyes as he gazed at me. He had smiled and pointed at his lips, telling me that he had already received his reward for saving me. If he died, I shouldn't feel guilty anymore. At that moment, I couldn't hold back my sorrow any longer and cried out loud. This was the first time Brent had watched me walk away, and it would also be the last time I saw him in this lifetime. Brent died in that fire. Sigrid had deliberately started the fire, and her actions were harshly punished by the law. But I knew Brent's parents wouldn't let her off so easily. After escaping the fire, I fell seriously ill and spent a long time in a daze. When I finally recovered, I secretly boarded a flight alone. Brent had died because of me, and I thought that in this lifetime, Dennis and I would never have a chance again. I stayed in a fishing village by the sea for a year, and it was then that I had my first dream of Brent. He said Dennis had been going crazy searching for me. He never expected that after he died, he'd still have to help Dennis one last time. He went on and on, but when I woke up, the only thing I remembered was him smiling and saying goodbye. I was startled awake by a knock on the door. Elsa. When I opened the door, I fell into a familiar, comforting embrace. The end.